Hello, my name is Osha. I like talking about American presidents, and today I'm going to be talking about Chester A. Arthur, our 21st president, and his implementation of the civil service reform. That was the Pendleton Act in 1883. So, of course, I'm going to give the backstory, what led to um, civil service reform by Chester A. Arthur. Um, I did an earlier video. I think you can find that on my Facebook. We discussing, the party bosses and the patronage system. So they were the political bosses of the 19th century. They were very prominent. I've talked about the Albany Regency, led by Martin Van Buren, who had been initially vice president to Andrew Jackson. And of course, I talked about the Tammany Hall Society of New York City. These were strong political machines, right? So in the 19th century, the boss system was prominent. It was prevalent. So there was a reason why the boss system existed. The purpose was to control the spoils system. Of course, they needed to pick their candidates, win elections, and control the spoils system. So the spoils system was also called the political patronage system. After the president won elections, right, the president actually controlled he controlled federal appointments. So not just appointing his cabinet, he also appointed his he appointed he made political appointments to many federal positions. One of them that was very popular was the collector of New York, right? The collector of the port of New York, which Chester A. Arthur had actually been, he'd been collector of the port of the state of New York, which was a very lucrative position. It was more lucrative than the it earned his salary was actually more than and his total income was more than that of the president of the United States as collector of the port of New York. And so there are many all other political appointments, federal positions in the civil service, which was controlled by the president. And of course, the boss often wanted to be the one influencing these appointments because it made money. Why was it important? Because, guess what? When the appointment was made, when you got a federal civil service job, you were actually required back then with the spoils system, the political patronage system, to pay back a portion of your salary to the party called assessments, right? You could pay as much as 70%, sorry, as much as 7% of your salary, right? If you were a party acolyte, right, a loyalist who was fortunate to get a political appointment or a position in the federal civil service, then you paid an assessment. That's a percentage of your salary back to the party. It was mandated, it was required, and there was a way that the political party that controlled this patronage, there was a way they monitored it to make sure that loyalist party supporters were actually paying their assessments. They're paying a portion of their salary. Of course, the purpose was to for the party to be able to run their political campaigns and activities. And of course, the patronage system was actually, you can say it was designed by, it was instigated by Andrew Jackson and his vice president, who later became president, Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren, his mantra was, to the victor go the spoils. So the spoils system was particularly abused under Andrew Jackson. When Andrew Jackson became president, he actually, in his first term, replaced bureaucrats, right? Bureaucrats in the civil service, the federal government, with his own loyalists, right? His acolytes in the party, replaced 10% of federal government jobs in his first term. By the time he was out, of the presidency, but in his 2 terms, he had replaced almost 20%, right, of bureaucrats with his own party loyalists, and that was based on his motto. He believed that putting party loyalists would help him, implement his policy, and he believed that it was better for party loyalists to hold government jobs rather than government positions to be based on merit. So that was a spoil system. It was abused. So government job work was like a sinecure then, right? It was not based on merit. It was based on your party loyalty. And so this was abused. It created corruption. It created, they were just job seekers, right? After every successful campaign and elections, there were always job seekers milling about, Washington trying to get a job. And of course, this was so abused, it led to the situation with Charles Guiteau. Charles Guiteau was he was a member of the Republican Party, a disgruntled lawyer who ended up assassinating James Garfield. James Garfield was our 20th president, and he was a member of the Republican Party. He belonged to what they called the half-breeds. And so Charles Guiteau, he was mentally unstable. He believed James Garfield owed his ascendancy, his success as president to him. And so he expected to benefit from the spoil system, the patronage system. So he wanted a position as consul to Paris. And so he kept hanging around. But the Secretary of State at the time, James G. Blaine, he got offended, right, when Charles Guiteau approached him for the consulship of Paris position. And, the Secretary, James Blaine, snapped at him. He was Secretary of State at the time. He snapped at him saying, never in your life, that he should never again in his life ask him mention the consulship to Paris, to him, never in his life. And so, the offended, disappointed Charles Guiteau decided to assassinate the president, James Garfield, at the time. And so delusionally, he expected that with the assassination of James Garfield, that Chester A. Arthur would become president. Chester A. Arthur was a major beneficiary of the spoil system. He had never sought political office before in his life, right? In fact, the reason why he ended up being on the vice presidential ticket was because he was a protege of a guy called Roscoe Conkling. Roscoe Conkling was a major party boss, right? He was probably the most powerful man in America at the time. And so Roscoe Conkling had been the leader of the stalwart faction of the Republican Party. And so he had been trying to get Ulysses Grant to get a third term. But, there was a split, a division, factionalism over the spoil system, because it was after the Civil War, and the Democrats who had created the spoil system, right, under the Jacksonian Democrats who had created the spoil system, they were now, of course, on the losing side. And as was the mantra, the mantra at the time, that to the victor go the spoils. The Republicans, right, the stalwart faction, they believed that that they should control the patronage system and have all the federal government appointments, go to the Republican Party, and they should benefit from them. So those were the stalwarts. They wanted to keep the spoil system, right? And Roscoe Conkling was able to control the lucrative spoil system. But there was not another group within the Republican Party called the half-breeds. So they were derogatorily called the half-breeds because, the stalwarts were saying these can't be real Republicans, because real Republicans should want the spoil system, because that the Republican Party won the Civil War, and they should be the ones benefiting from the spoils system, the patronage system, because the patronage system brought in a lot of money, right? So it wasn't just the salary to the political appointee who took the job as a sinecure, since he wasn't even qualified, right? It wasn't based on merit, it was based on your party loyalty. And so, but you were required based on assessments, right? You paid an assessment that's paying as much as 7% of your salary back to the party, right? So the political party, they made money from the political appointments that were made through the spoil system. And so by chance, Chester A. Arthur, in order to placate, um, um, placate Roscoe Conklin, since uh, Grant was not nominated for a third term, they placed Chester A. Arthur, who was the protege of Roscoe Conklin. They placed him on the ticket uh, with James Garfield. James Garfield was just a dark horse compromise candidate who was not interested in, the presidency. In fact, he had gone all the way to, travel down just to support his, his fellow Ohioan, one Sherman guy, and but somehow with some maneuverings he got, because there was division, and somehow he got nominated on the 36th ballot as to lead the party ticket for president, and so they picked Chester A. Arthur to sort of appease Roscoe Conklin and reconcile the party. But in any event, let me go back to the spoil system and the party bosses. So at the time, again, the stalwarts were led by, the stalwarts was a faction within the Republican Party. So of course, there were the Republicans and the Democrats. The Democrats had lost the war. They mainly dominated the South, and the Republicans, that was a party of Lincoln, and that was a party of Ulysses Grant. Now, I guess that was one reason why Ulysses Grant is not considered a great president. Of course, there's some reassessment today. He was actually, to me, he was a great president. But I think one reason was because of the spoil system, right? The spoil system, and the fact that he was controlled by the perception that he was controlled by his party, especially by Roscoe Conklin. So Roscoe Conklin was a very impressive man. Roscoe Conklin controlled the patronage system through the Republican Party. He was a New Yorker. He was a giant of a man. He was 6 feet 3 inches, right? Very impressive, very brilliant man. Interestingly, just to show you how significant the spoil system was, how lucrative it was, Roscoe Conklin was offered the position of Chief Justice of the United States, right, by President Grant in 1873. Roscoe Conklin turned it down. In 1882, his protege, when he became president, that's Chester A. Arthur, offered him the position again. No, this time he offered him the position of Associate Justice of the Supreme Court in 1882. He turned it down again. This time he was actually confirmed by the Senate. They'd gone through everything, confirmed him by the Senate, right? It was, right? He was approved to be a justice. He turned it down. So he turned this position down twice. First of all, in 1873, after Chief Justice Salmon P. Chase died, when he was first offered by Ulysses Grant, President Grant, he turned it down. And again, that was in 1873, he turned it down then. That was Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. He turned it down again in 1882 when he was offered by his protege, who was now president. That was Chester A. Arthur. And the reason was, he said that he preferred the rough and tumble of politics, right? Because he felt that being a U.S. senator allowed him to be more powerful, right? It was a more powerful position than the Chief Justice and the Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. He said he would forever be gnawing at his chains, right, as a justice on the Supreme Court, because the patronage system was very lucrative. It was very important, right? And he controlled the party boss, the party system, right? He was a party boss of from New York, and they controlled the patronage system, which of course again was very lucrative. They picked presidents, they picked candidates, they picked positions, and they got assessments from it, right? Everybody who got a political appointment was mandated to pay 7% of their income to the party. And so Roscoe Conklin didn't want any position. He didn't want the Chief Justice position because he said, as a U.S. Senator, he was more powerful. He could do more work. And he did a lot of significant work. He was very talented. He was a brilliant man. He was a district attorney at the age of 21. He was a brilliant man, Roscoe Conklin. They said his brilliance approached, it was borderline. If they said Roscoe Conklin was a genius, nobody would be shocked, right? It was very impressive. He was a great orator. And, he was very significant. He was a drafter of the 14th Amendment that we're all proud of today. We all talk about the 14th Amendment. And so, so he controlled that spoils system, as a senator and as a party boss. The spoils system benefited a lot of people. There were African Americans at the time, just after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, that benefited from the spoils system. And for instance, there are people like, I've done a video before talking about African Americans who benefited from it. Notably, everybody knows Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass had been recorder of deeds, in Washington, D.C. He had been consul general to Haiti. He had been a U.S. Marshal. So that was part of the spoils system. Spoils system, it controlled federal appointments. So you could see Roscoe Conklin did not want to be Chief Justice, right? So he can remain a party boss and control the spoils system. However, it was such a corrupt, right? It was such a corrupt system. That's the civil service. The government work was so corrupt, and it was filled with incompetent men. People were incompetent. Government work was just a sinecure because it was a way for the party to continue to get money, right? They made money since the federal employees were required to actually pay assessments, a portion of their income back to the party. So there was a lot of incompetence in the federal government at that time, in the federal civil service. So until this guy, Charles Guiteau, then assassinates James Garfield, because James Garfield was not supported by Roscoe Conklin, because James Garfield, even though he hadn't declared if he was really a stalwart or a half-breed, because the half-breeds wanted to civil service reform, right? The stalwarts wanted to keep the spoils system because they believed in the mantra that the Democrats were the ones who first pioneered that to the victor go the spoils. So the Republicans, the stalwart faction led by Roscoe Conklin, they wanted to keep the spoils system. But the Democrats, of course, didn't want the spoils systems anymore because they lost the Civil War. They didn't have access to the patronage system, and they felt left out. So, and they didn't like the idea of the Republican Party also giving federal appointments to Black Americans, right? And so Roscoe Conklin was a stalwart. He wanted to put Ulysses Grant to get a third term. That's another thing the stalwarts wanted. They wanted Ulysses Grant to get a third term. And because Roscoe Conklin felt he could actually control Ulysses Grant. So I guess that's the reason many people don't assess President Grant as a great president, even though to me he's one of my favorite presidents, right? But the half-breeds, right, wanted to end the spoils system. They didn't want it, even though the half-breeds were they were part of the Republican Party. And that's why the pejorative, the stalwarts call them half-breeds. They couldn't be real Republicans, because if they were Republicans, they should want the spoils system, because, to the victor go the spoils. So somehow, with a lot of maneuvering, James Garfield, who really was leaning towards the half-breeds, he wanted to civil service reform. James Garfield ended up narrowly winning the presidency. And James Garfield was another brilliant president we had. He was a lawyer. He was a preacher. He's the only president we've had who was actually a pastor. He was a pastor. He was a lawyer. He was a mathematician. He actually is associated with a proof. He formulated a proof associated with the Pythagorean theorem. So he was going to reform the civil service. And Roscoe Conklin had an idea that was what he was intending to do, and that's why Roscoe Conklin did not really give him his support. So James Garfield was planning on reforming the civil service, but however, he gets assassinated by Charles Guiteau, this disgruntled lawyer who felt that he'd written him a speech. He wrote a speech that was insignificant, and he felt that speech was what helped James Garfield become president. And so he started hanging around, loitering around, trying to get a position as consul to Paris. Right? He initially wanted another one as consul to Vienna. Then he preferred consul to Paris, and he was trying to get this position. And James G. Blaine, who was now Secretary of State, he was actually a half-breed. He got pissed, and he told him, he rebuffed him, and Guiteau decides to assassinate James Garfield, delusionally thinking, in fact, he screamed it out. He thought that, well, after he shot him. After he shot Garfield, he screamed out that, well, that Chester A. Arthur is president. So he's thinking Chester A. Arthur is going to reward him with a position, right, in government. And Chester A. Arthur, he becomes president. After it took a while for James Garfield to die. He suffered excruciatingly for several weeks. In fact, they said it wasn't the shot that killed him, that he could have been saved. It was infection, that the medical doctors were incompetent. The medical doctors, inadvertently infected him, caused an infection, and so he died of the infection. He died many weeks after. And so Chester A. Arthur became president, and Chester A. Arthur, who had never sought political office, he had never contested in an election, right, for any political position. He had been a main beneficiary of these patronage jobs, right, the spoil system, especially the New York patronage system, which Roscoe Conklin controlled because it was the most lucrative, right? And the collector of the Port of New York, that was a job Chester A. Arthur had actually held for a long time, right? It was wealthier. That position earned more money than President of the United States. There were many of these lucrative positions, especially in New York. And that was what Roscoe Conklin wanted to control. So I guess, bizarrely, the man who had benefited from the spoil system throughout his life, who didn't plan on becoming president, who was just like some kind of, they used him to placate Roscoe Conklin. He had been Roscoe Conklin's boy. Boy, I guess saying protege is a more benign term. So Chester A. Arthur was Roscoe Conklin's protege. They would end up falling out anyway, even though Chester A. Arthur offers him Associate Justice of the Supreme Court again. Roscoe Conklin would end up resigning as senator in protest. He didn't want to be a part of politics anymore, and went back to the practice of law. Chester A. Arthur was now bent on reforming the civil service. So he implemented the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act of 1883, which now required the civil service to be merit-based, and people couldn't get jobs in the civil service based on their party affiliation anymore. So we see how the tragic assassination of President James Garfield by a job seeker, the lunatic Charles Guiteau, how it led, Chester A. Arthur, who had benefited from the spoil system throughout his career, decided to actually end the spoil system and create, the civil service reform, which now made civil service merit-based. This is important to me because I'm a civil servant, and unfortunately, the civil services in the U.S. is still corrupt, right? In fact, I've been talking about how I've been wrongfully detained based on subornation of perjury and color of law violations, right? And based on subornation of perjury and fraud on the courts. This is all color of law violations, and this was because I was a federal civil servant and I reported misconduct, and through some kind of complex, dubious, back channel dealing, right? There was sort of like a conspiracy to violate my civil rights, and so I was swatted, and it was retaliation to my reporting misconduct I reported senior executives in the Federal Civil Service, in the Department of Defense. I reported misconduct, and, I was framed, and they used a corrupt criminal justice system in Montgomery County, Maryland. So they have corrupt judges like Judge James Bonifant, a corrupt judge like Judge B.B. Berry, and they used my emergency contact. So they retaliated against me, right? So you're seeing the corruption in the civil service still exists. They retaliated against me, and I was framed, right? Retaliated against. And even though we have all these laws, we have what's called the Whistleblower Protection Act, which protects civil servants against retaliation for reporting misconduct. We see these things fail. They don't work, right? So I've been wrongfully detained. I was framed by Montgomery County Police. And you see that the DMV area is one big corrupt bureaucracy. So you can see where the president is coming in when he's issuing DOGE, right? The DOGE thing. Because there's corruption in the federal civil service. Big time, right? And there's still people who government work, civil service work is still a sinecure, right? So this is what I've experienced. I was a McCain fellow. I work honestly, diligently. I just reported misconduct, and all of a sudden, there's retaliation. I see everything is just falling apart. This is what happens in movies where you watch Minority Report, or is it Changing Lanes, where they can just delete somebody, alter somebody's life. It's this what I've been experiencing is like a movie. So it's more advanced, more sophisticated corruption going on in the U.S. Federal Civil Service. But I've been hanging in there. I'm a Christian. I've been enduring the abuses, the retaliation. But it's so unfortunate, the subterranean measures they use, the surreptitious means. Very unscrupulous, and the people I reported, some of the people I reported for misconduct, so you see there's still cronyism going on, nepotism. They're children of civil servants, right? They're children of civil servants. So the federal government continues to appoint jobs, they continue to appoint people who live in the area, right? Based on their affiliation to previous people who work for the government themselves, even though they're supposed to report these things. But, fraud goes on extensively in the federal civil service, in the federal government. It goes on. They use federal civil service work as quid pro quo. So you might get a job, somebody gets you in, and the person who gets you in, maybe a boss, they expect to sleep with you, right? They sleep with the person, and they use it as inducement. They don't make it obvious, right? They use... they do it surreptitiously. They try to, have intimate relations with you. And if you resist these things, then they retaliate, right? And everything goes awry with you. Everything goes haywire, right? All of a sudden you find that you're being, there's a smear campaign going on. You see you're being framed by police. You're being swatted. They swat you. I was swatted in my home. They reported a false crisis call. So my emergency contact at work, right, who's not even blood related with me, that's Jide Wari. They used him. They use all sorts of dubious means, and it's been almost 3 years. So you see there's still corruption in the federal civil service. So there was a spoil system in the 19th century with the assassination of President James Garfield. Chester A. Arthur, our 21st president, then implemented the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883 to end the spoil system and make the federal civil service merit-based. But unfortunately today, even though it is nominally merit-based, well, I got in based on merit. I was fortunate, right? I got in based on merit, but there's still corruption in the federal civil service. So the idea of civil service reform was to end corruption, because the spoil system ended corruption, right? Was to end corruption. The spoil system created corruption. It engendered corruption in the system. And the idea was to end it and make the civil service merit-based and more based on qualifications and competency, let people do effective work for the government. But there are also ways that this continues to be undermined, despite the reforms, right? Despite these guardrails, right? It's still undermined, where human beings will always look for means of undermining guardrails and the checks and balances you create in the system to make it work effectively. And this is what I'm finding in the Federal Civil Service, my experience in the Department of Defense and the Department of the Navy, right? It's a huge bureaucracy, and where there's money involved, there's still, a lot of corruption that goes on. And this is the retaliation I suffered, and I have not been protected. My name is Olurotimi Osha. I just wanted to talk about the abuses that occurred in the 19th century, which instigated the civil service reform by President Chester A. Arthur. I'll keep you posted. Thank you.